Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. How did we get here? Yeah. How did the United States, Israel, and Iran get here? Everyone says that they are on the verge of creating a nuclear bomb. Well, it turns out that's not quite true. Our own Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said, no, that's not true. But then someone twisted her arm and made her change her mind or change her, maybe not her mind, but certainly her public stance. But it's a little bit deeper than that, everybody. And we've got to talk about that. Do you know what the IAEA is? Many of us don't know what these entities that shape our lives are. These are the people who absolutely, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they are the people who are in charge of really examining the nukes. And we were told, of course, that Iran's on the verge of creating a bomb, and that has not been true. But you know what? The funny thing happened on the way to the forum. It turns out that that agency's been hijacked. So we're going to talk with this brilliant investigative journalist. He and Medea Benjamin came together and gave us a wonderful opinion piece that's right, you've seen me post it on Common Dreams. You know, I love Common Dreams. How the U.S. and Israel used Rafael Grossi to hijack the IAEA and start a war in Iran. And it's not just any war, everybody. Many people have said, you know what? Some people say we're already in World War III. How did we get here? What is the IAEA? Who headed up? What is their connection to the United Nations? How is it that the people who are at the top of the heap there can somehow or another end up at the top of the United Nations? These people really effectively run parts of the world. But how independent are they? How really can we trust them? It's really what it comes down to. And so I'm so excited to welcome you, this brilliant investigative journalist. I'm so excited that I got Nicholas Davies on here. Of course, you work with my dear friends, my sister's beloved over at Code Pink and my brother's beloved. But you've been doing so much research into this because what's happened at the IAEA really is a scandal. It really is. When you look at Tulsi Gabbard, who has been, I mean, she left the Democratic Party because she said, you know, she questioned the analysis of intelligence, and she's called the intelligence community out. So for her to be the director of national intelligence was a really big deal. And she said, look, Iran's not a problem. But she's had to change her mind. Now, you've got to help me to understand what's happening here. First of all, the IAEA, what is it and who heads it up, and how free and independent are they? I think maybe that's the question. First of all, who are they? What do they do?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Yeah, I mean, we have all these international institutions. The IAEA is actually part of the United Nations. It comes under the organization of the United Nations, and it was set up as after atomic energy was discovered, and then of course the U.S. exploded 2 nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II. It was an important issue for the world, as it still is, to develop atomic energy and get the benefits of it, but to actually prevent nuclear war. And we all disagree about nuclear energy. Some people think it's a good idea, the way to reduce carbon emissions, although of course we have plenty of solar and wind and geothermal and all these other types of energy if we actually decided to use them. And we don't need nuclear energy to make electricity, and nobody has figured out what to do with all the nuclear waste. However, the peaceful use of nuclear energy is one thing. There are medical applications too. I once had a what they call a benign brain tumor, which sounds like a contradiction, but it was not cancer, but it was a tumor, a big lump inside my skull, and that was treated with nuclear energy. Was treated with a linear accelerator. That was 14 years ago, and I've never had a problem with it since. So, you know, the big lump was shrunk by the nuclear blast that they directed at it. And so there are useful uses for nuclear energy, and the IAEA was set up under the United Nations to do all of that, to actually promote helpful uses of nuclear energy and coordinate uses of nuclear energy around the world, but at the same time to prevent them being diverted for military uses. And the IAEA charter, you know, that all 180 countries in the world all belong to. Let's see if I've got the quote here from our article. And yes, the official purpose of the IAEA is to promote the safe, secure, and peaceful use of nuclear technologies. And they to ensure that they are not used in such a way as to further any military purpose. Now, of course, there's a problem with that, because even when those words were written, you know, the US already had diverted nuclear energy to make bombs. And at this point in the world, there are 9 countries that do have nuclear weapons. Israel is another one of them. And so there's a contradiction here. How does the IAEA do what it says it is there to do when, you know, there are 9 countries out there that have precisely diverted nuclear material in connection with the not just possible but actual military dimensions?
But let me ask you this: how is it? Because you hear so much made of certainly Israel having nuclear weapons to be used for military purposes, and the IAEA, they say nothing.
Right. Well, actually, I mean, the IAEA does have responsibility for all those countries which are IAEA members. But of course, if they already have nuclear weapons, how do the IAEA has safeguards, a safeguards system to supervise all the atomic energy.
But they're not distributed equally. Please explain this safeguard system.
Well, they keep track of all the enriched uranium and other radioactive materials in each country, to make sure they're not diverted for military purposes. I mean, that's what they're doing in Iran. But of course, if a country has already done that or is already doing it, then what's the IAEA going to do? So it has safeguard agreements, even with the United States, but they are based on what they call voluntary offers to uncover only selected sites. In other words, the US and Russia and China and the United Kingdom and France, they essentially only show the IAEA what they want to show them. The IAEA cannot just march in to, an American factory where they're making nuclear weapons and say, oh, we need to record everything you're doing here. They don't let them do that. So yes, it's a limited system of control over nuclear energy, and that really is unable, once a country has nuclear weapons, to really control that. But they try. And so, for instance, with India developed nuclear weapons without telling anybody, secretly. And so the IAEA got India to agree to keep its nuclear weapons program and its civilian nuclear program separate. And so the IAEA supervises the Indian civilian nuclear program, but not the weapons program. But it is able to monitor the civilian program to make sure that it is not taking material and technologies from that and moving them into its military program. So, there are things that the IAEA can do. And so it has this very difficult job of staying on top of all this and somehow preventing more countries from developing nuclear weapons. And in fact, in the past, it has done such a good job of that in 2005, the IAEA and its then director, Mohammed El-Baradei, an Egyptian diplomat, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And in fact, the reason they were given that award in 2005, 2 years after the United States invaded and the United Kingdom invaded Iraq, was because the IAEA and Mohammed El-Baradei really stood up to President Bush and stood up to the United States and refused to play along with their accusations that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program. Mohammed El-Baradei kept coming back to the UN Security Council saying, yes, we have all these inspectors in Iraq and they're looking everywhere they can, might possibly be, some secret nuclear weapons program. And we have been completely unable to find any evidence of a nuclear weapons program in Iraq. And for taking that, courageous stand to stand up against the United States and really try to defuse the march to war by saying that there wasn't anything there in terms of nuclear weapons. So for that, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And so this very difficult job that they have to do, there are times when they have done it very, very well.
But as they won the Nobel Peace Prize, I was about to call it the Nuclear Peace Prize too, because really, I think there's an understanding that if this power is misused, if it's abused, humanity won't survive ultimately.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So did they lose anything? Well, I mean, that's the issue. But did they lose anything in that process? Because clearly, in order to have won that Nobel Peace Prize, they also had to go up against the West. And the West does not take, the powerful do not take too kindly to confrontation and losing. Did they lose something?
Well, so each director of the IAEA serves usually for 10 years. And so in 2009, Mohammed El-Baradei's time was up, and they chose a new director. This is chosen by it's a combination of the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, but essentially because the current nuclear powers, 5 of them, all have vetoes in the UN Security Council, there's simply no way to choose a new director without the approval of all these or nuclear powers who are already violating the principles of the IAEA. I mean, it's another contradiction.
We
But,
don't understand how that works.
but anyway, so these Western countries, the US in particular, we're pretty unhappy with the way Mohammed el-Baradei stood up to them. And so in 2009, when they looked for his replacement, they did a really thorough vetting job of the candidates. And in fact, WikiLeaks, in their huge trove of US diplomatic cables that they leaked, there are cables about this vetting process. And so let me find that little quote from the article.
And I'm asking you those questions because I think we don't even understand what happens behind the scenes in an agency like, if I can call it an agency like the IAEA, that is of such tremendous consequence.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, what the US diplomats reported back to Washington about Yukiya Amano, who they wanted to be the new IAEA Director General, they said he was solidly in the US court on every key strategic decision, from high-level personnel appointments to the handling of Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program.
If he has the approval of the United States and these Western powers, what does that mean?
Well, it means he's not going to get vetoed. His appointment will not be vetoed by the United States. Now, it wasn't vetoed by Russia or China either. So, he was essentially a candidate that they could all agree on.
But what does that say about his politics?
Well, yeah, it's not going to be someone who's going to be too strong in opposing any of them, but in fact, I mean, he did do a reasonably good job. And when it comes to Iran, because this whole saga with Iran has been going on ever since that time, and in fact, it was in 2007 when el-Baradei was still at the IAEA, and he was saying, no, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. We've really searched and looked, and in fact, the US intelligence agencies, the CIA, they put out a national intelligence estimate in 2007, and they agreed with the IAEA that Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program, and that any research they may have done towards a nuclear weapons program, if it took place at all, it was before 2003. And that is still essentially the case. That is still what the IAEA has been reporting all these years later. But of course, the Western countries, have ideological differences with Iran, as they do with Russia and China. Ever since there was a revolution in 1979 that overthrew the Shah, a strongly US-backed dictator, who was one.
Is 1979 the issue really with Iran?
Well, it ultimately it is, because there was also a bunch of students who took over the US embassy back then and held US diplomats hostage there. So really, as in this crisis today, there has been discussion of regime change in Iran. Should the US, launch a war or some other, covert means to overthrow the government of Iran? Now, Trump ran on ending this whole series of regime change wars. The US has conducted these regime change wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and all over that part of the world. to say nothing of other parts of the world, such as Haiti, where they overthrew the government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the most popular elected um, president that Haiti ever had. So I mean, this is and they've kept threatening to overthrow the government of Venezuela, the government of Cuba, and so. But Trump came to office saying that he was going to end this cycle of U.S. regime change wars in the Middle East. He was not going to start any new wars. And here we are, what, 5 months into his presidency, and we've had this horrific war in Iran that the U.S. fully supported. Of course, it was Israel that actually launched, the actual airstrikes on Iran. But then when they got into some trouble and couldn't really do what they were trying to do, which they knew before they went in, of course, they implored the U.S. to come and bomb those particular sites for it. And the U.S. went in and did it. And yes, we've had what Trump now calls a 12-day war with Iran. Now, whether it is in fact over remains to be seen. We'll find out. But yeah, so getting back to the IAEA, there's Yukiya Amano, who was appointed with the full approval of the United States and its Western allies, when in 2015, President Obama realized that all these sanctions and all this pressure and all these threats against Iran were going nowhere. They were simply, all they did was prevent Iran from cooperating with the IAEA. And so IAEA, Iran was just actually developing its uranium enrichment program way beyond what it actually needed for most peaceful purposes. And so in fact, the situation under US sanctions was worse than it had been before they put on the sanctions. And so Obama negotiated an agreement. That's Obama with the governments of Britain, France, Russia, Germany, the European Union. They negotiated an agreement in which Iran stopped doing all its, making all its highly enriched uranium, went back to simply producing what it needed for that, to build nuclear power plants and do some medical applications, all those kind of things, and that was all working fine. They were only enriching the uranium to nearly all of it to 3.5% to make fuel for their nuclear power plants, and so the IAEA was in there. The IAEA was doing inspections and monitoring things, and putting out regular reports saying yes, everything's fine. They're abiding with the agreement, and then along comes Trump in 2017, and he starts condemning them again. And so eventually Trump withdrew the United States from this JCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran.
Well, we see the United States has a problem with Iran and Britain. That's the great unspoken, right? Because they all wanted Mossadegh, who was a democratically elected president from the 50s. They wanted him out. They pushed him out, and they put the Shah in. And then the Iranian people pushed back and pushed him out, and thus the revolution of 1979. Where does Israel fit in all of this? I mean, why are they so? I mean, they have these compilation videos of uh, Prime Minister Netanyahu before he was even an elected official, who was railing against Iran, and he was saying specifically they will become a nuclear power. That's a problem. And mind you, our own government pushed back against them becoming a nuclear power, right?
Well, Israel is using, by completely hyping the danger that Iran might acquire nuclear weapons, which Iran has consistently said it does not want nuclear weapons.
Why don't they want nuclear weapons?
Well, as um, as Colin Powell once said at the time of the JCPOA, he he said, why would Iran want a nuclear weapon when Israel has 200 of them and nearly all pointed at Tehran, the capital of Iran? In other words, what would the use of Iran having one or two nuclear weapons be? If they, God forbid, acquired a nuclear weapon and fired one at Israel, they would be obliterated by Israel with its nuclear weapons. So it really doesn't make sense. I mean, unless Iran somehow, you know, withdrew from the IAEA, withdrew from the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and then developed some secret program to the point where they could uh, somehow build, match what Israel has, which is about 200 nuclear weapons. Because it's all secret, that's an estimate. That was Colin Powell's estimate that they had by 2015, they had 200 nuclear weapons in Israel. But of course, Israel has never been satisfied with its situation in the Middle East, and Netanyahu and his Likud party, ever since he became elected prime minister, they have pushed to expand the borders of Israel into what they call it Greater Israel. They base it on the Old Testament of the Bible, and that they want Israel to have all the territory that Israel and Judea, the Jewish kingdoms back, thousands of years ago had back then. And so the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, which the rest of the world and the United Nations refer to as the occupied Palestinian territories, and have been insisting for what is it now? It's almost 50 years that Israel has to withdraw from those territories. Under Netanyahu, they refer to those territories as Judea and Samaria, which is their names from the Old Testament, and they are very close to their ambition is to actually annex those territories and make them part of Israel. And that is why they keep settling more of their own people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to gradually, piece by piece, take over those territories. And now, they also have a pretty good chunk of Syria that they militarily occupy. They still have forces operating in southern Lebanon, which they invaded. And Netanyahu has literally stood up in front of the United Nations and shown maps in which Israel just takes over all these territories and makes them part of Israel. This is, I mean, this is the absolute antithesis of what the United Nations Charter says countries can do. Every country in the world, when they joined the UN, agreed not to attack and invade its neighbors and incorporate their territory into its own. This is the most blatant, flagrant, most extreme violation of the rule of international law.
And you maintain that Israel and the United States have basically overtaken the IAEA. Could you explain how
well, okay. I think what we said in the article is they hijacked it.
Hijacked? Well, that to me is like you're overtaking a plane.
Yeah, well, yeah, or made it serve their purposes.
Mm.
In other words, since Rafael Grossi, the Argentinian diplomat, became the Director General of the IAEA in 2019. At that point, in 2018, Israel had come up with supposed intelligence that there were 3 sites in Iran that Iran had never disclosed where there were traces of enriched uranium. In other words, at some point, Iran had done something with these sites that involved enriching uranium or storing enriched uranium in these sites. So Grossi set out in 2019 to investigate that. He had meetings with Israeli officials and Israeli intelligence officials from the Mossad, and he negotiated with the Iranians to gain access to those sites. And eventually, the IAEA was allowed to inspect these sites, and sure enough, they did find some traces of enriched uranium. Now, so then the question is, where did that come from? How did it get there? The Iranians insist that they never did anything in those sites. So they have suggested, Iranian officials have suggested, well, maybe the Israelis put it there. And Rafael Grossi has never explained why he has discounted that possibility. But one way or the other, he kept pushing on these sites and did confirm the presence of some enriched uranium, some traces of it at least. And so then here we are in the middle of Israel committing a genocide in Gaza, basically trying to drive the Palestinians, either kill or drive the Palestinians out of Gaza. Israel, at the same time, in this past year and a half, has invaded Syria, taken a lot more territory. They already occupied some territory in Syria, but they've now occupied a lot more of it. They've had a war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they've been making all these threats against Iran. And so in the middle of that, Rafael Grossi writes a report on what the IAEA has found in these 3 sites in Iran, and he scheduled for the 12th of June a meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors. These are representatives of 35 countries to take a vote on a resolution condemning Iran over these traces of enriched uranium in these 3 sites. Also noting at the same time that, yes, since Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement with Iran, it has enriched a lot of uranium, up to 60%. 90% would be what you would need to make a weapon, but they have kept enriching uranium up to 60%. Really, this is, they clearly feel that this is their only leverage in negotiations with the US and these other countries to get these Western countries to agree to a new nuclear agreement, or essentially to restore the old one that they all agreed to in 2015. So they're using that as leverage. It doesn't necessarily mean that they want a weapon just because they have 60%. They have 400 kilos. That's like less than half a ton of uranium enriched to 60%. If they were trying to make a weapon, they could make a few weapons with that, maybe 9 or 10, something like that. But they still insist that that's not what they're doing. And it has never been proven that they are trying to do that they are trying to make a weapon. So Grossi schedules this resolution for June the 12th. Now, we can now see, looking back, on June the 12th, what was Israel doing? Israel was loading weapons on planes, fueling up the planes, putting drop tanks on them for this very long flight to Iran. And 2 days before that, on June the 10th, the US contacted 8 of those 35 countries on the IAEA Board of Governors, and it to twist their arms and demand that they either vote for this resolution or they simply don't vote at all. In other words, it really put on the pressure to prevent countries voting against this resolution. And in the end, only 3 did. And 2 of those were Russia and China. And I think the third one was maybe Mali, which is an ally of Russia. But 11 of the 35 countries abstained. They said, no, we're not going to vote for this. But, they didn't vote against it either. So the resolution passed. 19. It would have taken 18 to pass the resolution. So 19 voted for it. By a slim majority, they passed this resolution. And then what happened? That very night that resolution passed, Israel started bombing Iran. So, and the US and Israel and Britain and other countries, the Western country, immediately shifted, whereas the resolution was based on, the finding of traces of enriched uranium at 3 sites in Iran. They all shifted their political rhetoric immediately to say that Iran was on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon, which was not what the resolution had said. That's not what those 19 countries voted for. So
to be clear, the 19 countries voted for
a resolution to say that Iran was in violation of its safeguards agreement with the IAEA. And what should have happened then, under the rules of this whole game, is that Iran would have had 6 months to remedy that situation. I'm not sure exactly how they could have, because they have insisted all along they had nothing to do with that enriched uranium that had been found. But in 6 months' time, if they had not remedied that situation, the UN Security Council could meet and decide what to do about it. And one of the options would be for the Security Council to what they call snap back the previous sanctions that the Security Council had put against Iran before the JCPOA agreement was signed in 2015. So, but of course, Russia or China could have vetoed that. So really, in terms of the IA system, the consequences of this resolution were relatively mild. They certainly did not authorize any country to go and bomb Iran, which is what Israel did and what the United States then did, a week later. So, but when the US pressured those 8 countries to vote for the resolution, Israeli officials applauded that, and they said they said publicly that, oh, well, this demonstrated that the US supported what we were doing, that they supported our military action to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And so as we say in the article, that demonstrates that, Grossi bringing that resolution to the floor on the day that Israel was planning and preparing its warplanes to go and bomb Israel, that was important. That was important to the Israelis and to the Americans, that, because even though the resolution obviously did not authorize anyone to go and bomb Iran, it gave the assent. It gave the US and Israel this pretext, this sort of piece of diplomatic ammunition to say that Iran was violating its safeguard agreement with the IAEA. And so, this, I mean,
no, help me
I don't think anyone suggested that this was a coincidence that they passed this resolution the day that Israel was preparing to bomb Iran.
But help me to understand Russia and China's role in this, because they have an antagonistic, at least publicly, antagonistic relationship with the West, with UK, with Britain, with the United States, with these Western countries, and yet on something this crucial, because they knew where this was going, right? I mean, come on. Everyone knew that the United States and Israel have been looking for an end to take on, well, not the United States as much. Israel absolutely has been looking for a way to take on Iran. The United States has been more reluctant, at least publicly. I keep saying publicly, because when you see Russia and China say, well, okay, do what you will, have at it, you got to know that that's going down the rabbit hole, Nicholas Davies.
Well, I mean, Russia and China voted against that resolution at the IAEA, and I mean, they certainly did not approve anybody starting to bomb Iran. And
there's such a huge chunk of the world. Is there anything else that they could have done?
Well, I don't think there's anything they could have done that would not have vastly escalated the crisis. I mean, Pakistan offered nuclear weapons to Iran to retaliate against Israel. And I suppose Russia could have done the same, but I mean, this is just how dangerous this world is, with all these countries, including our own countries, having nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, and also
we have the same kind of situation in Ukraine, where if it gets out of control, we could end up with a nuclear war between the US and Russia over Ukraine.
But it seems like there's no check on these, on the United States, on Israel, on the West, because they're the ones who've used these weapons.
Well, the check, frankly, is that, whereas during the Cold War, the whole world was looking at the United States and looking at the Soviet Union, and the United States and Western Europe, through various means, but a lot of what you would call soft power, they had pretty good public relations, pretty good propaganda, if you will, to convince the neutral countries of the world that they were the good guys, and or at least that they were not the bad guys. And so when the Soviet and so there was a lot of goodwill. I mean, there was also always a lot of threatening and a lot of arm twisting and a lot of violence, but there was a counterpoint to that, which was the Soviet Union and Communist China, and most people in the West were convinced that they were, totalitarian, authoritarian states, and we didn't want to be like them. So, but then the Cold War ended. Mikhail Gorbachev essentially agreed to make peace with the West, to allow countries in Eastern Europe to go their own way. They withdrew any Soviet forces from those countries. They dissolved the Warsaw Pact, which was their equivalent of NATO, their alliance of those Eastern European countries to stand against NATO and the West. And so for the United States and the West to behave the way we have for the last 30 years or so, invading countries in the Middle East, bombing countries in the Middle East, waging wars that have killed literally millions of people. Medea and I made an estimate a few years ago that over 2 million people had been killed in Iraq, and that all these wars put together, it's very hard to tell. I mean, we're making a educated guess or an estimate, but probably something like 6 million people have been killed in all these wars that were launched by the US and its allies. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And we've also had coups in Haiti and coup in Honduras in 2009, attempted coups in Venezuela, endless horrific sanctions against Cuba, reducing it to such a state of poverty. And the rest of the world watches all this.
And yet,
and
North Korea.
we have this is the price the United States is paying.
But see, they're making the case with this, with the United States entering into this conflict publicly. They're making the case for people to have nuclear weaponry, because North Korea, quite frankly, I listen to people in the so-called global South, and they say, given the behavior of the West, I've got to protect myself. Because look at what you do to me when I don't have this nuclear deterrent.
Well, exactly. That's why, what Grossi did as IAEA director, working with Israel, an outlaw nuclear weapon state that secretly developed nuclear weapons and does not allow the IAEA to inspect its nuclear facilities, is then making the case, to make war on Iran, and with the full support of the United States. So yes, what is the rest of the world to make of this? And as Mohammad al-Baradei, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, when he was at the IAEA, he said, we quoted him at the end of the article, what is the rest of the world supposed to make of this? This only can lead, the way the United States and Israel behaved in this crisis can only lead other countries to conclude that they can't trust to just complying with the IAEA and complying with the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, because they will be vulnerable to be attacked by this outlaw nuclear weapon state, Israel, and by the United States. And of course, Iran has just essentially fought Israel to a very bloody and horrific draw
Mhm.
and they've now declared a ceasefire because is Iran does have the conventional weapons to
Mhm.
defend itself, and it was defending itself and fighting back against Israel. And just as Israel was sending drones that were, dropping bombs on Tehran and different parts of Iran, Iran was doing the same back to Israel. We don't know really, because of Israeli censorship, we don't know how many important Israeli military sites Iran was able to hit, but they also did hit some civilian targets and kill some Israeli civilians. But basically, I think there's, and many people believe that the reason Israel was willing to go for a ceasefire at this point is that Iran was doing more and more damage to Israel, and Israel was actually not able to destroy Iran's civilian nuclear program. So if this had continued, it probably would have gone worse and worse for Israel. And so they have all agreed to a ceasefire. And we'll see what happens now. But Saudi Arabia, the United States is helping Saudi Arabia to build nuclear power plants. And many few countries in the world trust Saudi Arabia, which, I mean, talking about an autocracy, I mean, they have a brutal absolute monarchy where they still execute dozens or hundreds of people every year by literally chopping off their heads with swords. And I mean, are these the kind of people you would want to have nuclear weapons? I mean,
But
you
this,
know,
but
this
the
is
United States, they dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese. I mean, it's like when you look at the West, do you want them to have it? No. I mean,
oh,
I mean, it's just, you don't want any of these people because my father often says that when you have power, you have to be careful because if you have it, you try not to use it because if you use it, you almost will surely abuse it, and when you abuse it, you will lose it. And the dangers you don't know when you've lost it. There is a looming. I mean, you have the global South that is on the rise, and you have we still do not know what Iran's capabilities are, and quite frankly, other countries who look at the West as a danger. And I don't think that those of us in the West, and I mean, and I would say, it'd be fair to say, oppressed peoples in the West understand the dangers of the West, even as we are Westerners.
mm.
But that having been said, and having said that, you understand that, wait a minute, you can't continue to subjugate people and think that they're not going to respond. And
Well,
I,
this is what we're confronting. This is the dilemma confronting the United States today and its Western European allies. Yeah, we're losing the goodwill of the world, and you're not going to be able to. And in the meantime, because we have threatened powerful countries like Russia and China, China now very possibly has weapons that are better than ours. In the recent little brief war between India
Mhm.
and Pakistan, this was the first time some of these new Chinese weapons actually saw combat, because of course China doesn't make war on anybody. It hasn't for decades, but Pakistan is flying Chinese, fourth generation warplanes, fighters, and it shot down uh, French warplanes that India was using. And India didn't shoot down any of the Pakistani ones. So there's a little, it's not much to go on as evidence, but it's a little bit of evidence that China's building some pretty useful weapons there. And if you know, if the United States thinks that by the use of military force, it can continue to sort of maintain a sort of number one position in the world, it really should think twice about that. Medea and I wrote an article recently where we looked at Trump's ambition to keep America as the number one nation in the world. And we said, look, if the IMF evaluates the economic strength of countries based on what they call purchasing power parity, in other words, not what is this country's economy worth simply in US dollars, but what can each country buy with the wealth and resources and productive capacity that it has. And on that basis, China overtook the United States some time ago.
They did, and they're also the number one trading partner of the world.
Yes, absolutely.
They have more economic.
They're the ones making everything.
Yeah.
The United States has financialized its economy. All these American companies thought, you know, they could make more money by doing the actual dirty work of actually making stuff in poorer countries where the labor was cheaper. And now the US no longer knows how to make all these things, while China has been developing and developing and developing. So really, the idea that the United States, by spending, you know, as much on its military as the next 10 countries in the world, can somehow maintain its power in the world by the threat and use of force is a pipe dream. And we are, instead of building our own country, we are wasting our resources on this fantasy of military power. And Trump, you know, while Trump promises falsely to be a president for peace, he is still a president for these military delusions, this dangerous militarism that says we can threaten and fight our way to remaining the top dog in the world. And I really hope that you know, I mean, yes, they can go and bomb poor countries and reduce them to rubble. You know, yes, your weapons can do that. Aircraft carriers can do that. But we're seeing in Ukraine where Western military force is coming up against Russia. Russia did not outsource its military production after the end of the Cold War, and did not privatize all its armaments companies. And the result is that that all of NATO put together is only able to produce about a quarter of the number of artillery shells that Russia produces all by itself. And when you're actually fighting over a territory like this, in a war of attrition, you know, those are the kind of things that ultimately make the difference. And it is just so tragic for this country that we are wasting $1 trillion a year on a war machine that cannot even win a war. The United States has not won a war, not a serious war, since the Second World War, since 1945. The only wars we've won have been short wars to recover neo-colonial outposts in Kuwait in 1991, Panama in 1989, and Grenada in 1983. Mm-hmm. Every other war, every time the United States has got more deeply involved in a war somewhere, whether it's Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the results have just been catastrophic.
Well, it seems that we've won invasions, but not wars. right?
Well, but how, what does that mean to win an invasion?
I
What are
mean,
we,
to me, I'm
well,
with.
what are we going to do? Yes, we've removed the government of another country.
You're
We've
not
pulled
winning.
the crap out of it. What are we going to do now? This is what they've confronted. They ended up in all these countries facing massive popular resistance.
But see, but that I'm speaking to your point. We're
Yeah.
not winning. We're not winning. And I will say this because I want you to close this out. President Trump, in his first term, called President Carter, and he said, now that I'm here, I'm seeing something very different. I'm sure you heard about this report." And he said, "Hey, China is winning. They're developing. They're making money. What's our problem? We're not on pace to stay number one." I'm paraphrasing him. And President Carter responded to him. He said, "We're at war, they're not." He said, "Mr. President, they build things. Our money is in war."
Mm.
So it's not that Trump is a peacemaker or warmonger. I think he's a pragmatic man. He's a businessman. This model that we have will not work. You know that. We're not generating goodwill, which is to your point. Your final thought here, because
Absolutely. But unfortunately, like every other American, Trump has been propagandized and brainwashed and indoctrinated to believe that this $1 trillion war machine is good for something. And so he is still threatening everyone all over the world. And this is the trouble with having this war machine, is that, Americans are then brainwashed to think that it's actually good for something other than simply destroying things and killing people, which is all it does.
Nicholas Davies, everybody. Oh, I cannot wait to have you back. Code Pink, he's been working with them, investigative journalist. This is why we're here, everybody. This is why we're here. Blessings to you. My love to everyone at Code Pink, my brothers and sisters over there. My love to you. Thank you. I cannot wait to have you back on the show, Nick Davies.
I look forward to that. Thank you for having me.
Much love and many blessings. The Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota.